The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding a secret. It started like any other day, with normal routines, familiar faces, and no warning of the horror that was about to unfold. People in this small town trusted each other. Doors were often left unlocked, neighbors waved, kids played outside until the sun dipped low. It felt safe, comfortable, almost too peaceful. But behind that calm surface, something dark was already moving. Long before the crime happened, there were signs that something wasn't right. Small moments, odd behaviors. Conversations that seemed normal at the time but later felt chilling. People remembered strange comments, unusual actions, and a sense that something was off, even if they couldn't explain why. On the day it all began, the air felt normal. No alarms, no panic, no visible threat. The victims went about their lives the way they always had. Plans were made, errands were run. Calls were answered, smiles were shared. Then, in a single stretch of time, everything changed. The first discovery sent shockwaves through the community. At first, no one could believe it. The idea that something so brutal could happen here felt unreal. Rumors spread fast, people whispered. Police sirens broke the silence. As investigators arrived, they realized this wasn't just a simple crime. The scene told a story of violence, fear, and struggle. Every detail mattered. Every mark, every object, every trace could reveal what happened in those final moments. The victims were ordinary people known in the community. They had families, friends, dreams. Their loss hit hard because they weren't strangers. They were part of everyday life. As news spread, the town shifted from calm to terrified. Parents kept their children inside. Neighbors looked at each other differently. Trust cracked. Everyone wondered the same thing: who could do this and why? Early reports caused confusion. Some details were unclear. Others were misinterpreted. The story kept changing as more information came out. Speculation filled the gaps where facts were missing. Law enforcement worked through the night, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and trying to piece together a timeline. When did it start? How long did it last? Was there one attacker or more? Each answer led to more questions. The crime scene suggested planning. This wasn't random. There were signs of intent, of preparation, of someone who knew what they were doing. That realization made the situation even more frightening. People began looking back at recent events, trying to connect dots. A strange visitor, a heated argument, a person acting out of character. Anything that could explain how this tragedy unfolded. Meanwhile, families of the victims struggled to understand what had happened. Shock turned into grief. Grief turned into anger. They wanted answers, they wanted justice, and they wanted it fast. The media picked up the story quickly. Headlines spread across the region. Reporters flooded the town. Cameras rolled. Every new development became public almost instantly. With attention came pressure. Investigators faced intense demand to solve the case. They reviewed phone records, checked financial activity, studied surveillance footage. Every possible lead was examined. Some leads turned out to be dead ends. Others raised new suspicions. At the same time, fear continued to grow. People locked their doors at night. Outdoor gatherings stopped. The once friendly atmosphere felt tense and guarded. Behind the scenes, detectives began building a clearer picture of the timeline. They mapped out the victims' last known movements, who they spoke to, where they went, what they planned to do next. Piece by piece, a narrative started forming. The attacker's actions suggested both emotion and calculation. There were moments that looked impulsive, and others that seemed deliberate. That mix made it harder to understand the mindset behind the crime. Neighbors recalled sounds from that night. Some heard nothing. Others remembered noises but assumed it was something harmless. In hindsight, those memories felt haunting. As interviews continued, investigators noticed patterns in statements. Certain names came up more than once. Certain places kept appearing in conversations. Slowly, a list of persons of interest began to take shape. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Evidence had to match, timelines had to line up, motives had to make sense. While detectives worked, the community tried to cope. Candlelight vigils were held. People gathered to honor the victims. Tears flowed. Stories were shared. The emotional weight felt overwhelming. For many, sleep became difficult. Every creak in the night sounded louder. Every unfamiliar face seemed suspicious. The sense of safety people once had felt shattered. Behind closed doors, investigators debated theories. Was this personal? Was it planned long in advance? Was there a trigger that pushed someone over the edge? Every theory was tested against the facts. As new information surfaced, it became clear that this case would not be simple. The deeper they dug, the more complex it became. Motives appeared layered. Relationships mattered. Past conflicts, financial pressures, emotional tensions, all of it could play a role. At the center of everything was one burning question. What truly happened in those final hours? The answer wouldn't come all at once. It would emerge slowly, through careful work, hard evidence, and persistence. This tragedy marked a turning point for the town. People realized that danger doesn't always come from far away. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. And as the investigation moved forward, one thing became certain: this story was far from over. If you're finding this story gripping so far, make sure to like the video, share it with others who love true crime, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. As the investigation pushed forward, the pressure on law enforcement kept rising. Every hour that passed without clear answers made the town more anxious. People wanted closure, but the truth was still buried under layers of uncertainty. Detectives began focusing on the timeline leading up to the crime. They retraced the victim's final movements step by step, where they went, who they spoke to, what they might have been worried about. Even the smallest detail could turn out to be a major clue. Friends and family were interviewed repeatedly. Some tried their best to help, while others struggled to speak through grief. Memories poured out: routines, habits, recent changes in behavior. Investigators listened closely, searching for patterns that might reveal hidden tensions or motives. Gradually, certain connections started to stand out. There were relationships that seemed strained. Conversations that felt tense in hindsight. Moments that once felt normal now carried a heavier meaning. It became clear that this crime didn't happen in isolation. It was tied to emotions, history, and choices made long before that night. Rumors continued to swirl through the community. Some theories spread faster than facts. People speculated about suspects, motives, and possible cover-ups. In a town not used to tragedy on this scale, fear often fueled imagination. But investigators stayed focused on evidence. Forensic teams examined every trace left behind: footprints, fibers, fingerprints, digital records. Even small fragments of information could help reconstruct what happened. Technology played a growing role, allowing detectives to analyze phone activity, message history, and movement patterns. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle. At the same time, police explored whether the crime was spontaneous or planned. Certain elements suggested preparation, timing, movement, and awareness of surroundings. Whoever committed the act seemed to understand where they were and what they were doing. That realization made the case feel more calculated than chaotic. As leads developed, detectives narrowed their attention to individuals whose behavior seemed unusual before or after the crime. Some had conflicting alibis, others showed changes in routine. A few displayed emotional reactions that raised questions. Still, nothing could be assumed without proof. Investigators cross-checked statements for inconsistencies. If one person said they saw something at a certain time, that claim was verified against call logs, travel routes, and other witness accounts. The goal was to build a solid timeline that could stand up to scrutiny. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The events leading up to the crime showed rising tension. There were emotional triggers, personal conflicts, and unresolved issues that may have built up over time. It wasn't just about what happened that night, it was about what led there. Families of the victims struggled with waiting. Every update felt too slow. Every rumor felt painful. They wanted justice, but they also wanted truth. They needed to understand why their loved ones had been taken. The emotional toll on them was heavy. Meanwhile, media coverage continued to grow. News stations ran special reports. Online discussions exploded. Some coverage helped bring attention to important facts, while other reports added confusion or spread misinformation. Investigators had to balance public pressure with careful, methodical work. Behind the scenes, case files grew thicker. Evidence boards filled with photos, timelines, names, and locations. Detectives debated different theories, which ones fit the facts and which ones didn't. One major question remained at the center: motive. Was this driven by anger, jealousy, revenge, fear? or something more complex? Understanding the motive could help explain the behavior behind the crime and guide investigators toward the right suspect. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered past conflicts and emotional strains that had gone unnoticed by most people. Old arguments, lingering grudges, financial stress, personal disappointment. Any of these could have played a role. Nothing was ruled out. At the same time, new witnesses came forward. Some had been afraid to speak earlier. Others only realized later that what they saw might be important. Each new statement was carefully evaluated and added to the growing case file. Some accounts matched, others conflicted. Sorting truth from memory, exaggeration, or fear wasn't easy. Investigators revisited key locations connected to the case. They searched for overlooked evidence, reviewed surveillance footage again, and re-interviewed people who might have missed critical details the first time. Every revisit brought fresh insight. The town remained on edge. Normal life felt disrupted. People locked doors earlier, watched strangers more closely, and talked about the case in hushed tones. What once felt safe now carried an undercurrent of unease. For many, the tragedy served as a harsh reminder that darkness can exist even in familiar places. As the case progressed, certain patterns in the suspect's behavior became more visible. There were actions that hinted at planning, and others that revealed emotional instability. That contrast suggested a complicated mindset, someone capable of both careful thought and impulsive decisions. That complexity made profiling more difficult. Still, law enforcement pressed forward. They compared evidence to known records. They checked past complaints, prior incidents, and any history that could help explain the suspect's behavior. If there had been warning signs, investigators wanted to find them. Meanwhile, the victims' stories continued to shape the emotional heart of the case. People remembered their kindness, their goals, their everyday moments. Their humanity reminded everyone that this wasn't just a headline, it was real lives cut short. As days turned into weeks, progress felt slow but steady. Each confirmed detail strengthened the foundation of the case. Each eliminated possibility narrowed the field. The path to the truth wasn't straight. It twisted through uncertainty, emotion, and hard evidence. And yet momentum was building. Detectives began to focus more strongly on specific individuals whose connections to the victims and the timeline made them stand out. Their movements were scrutinized. Their statements were re-examined. Their past actions were reviewed. Every new piece of information brought investigators closer to understanding what truly happened. The case was far from solved, but the fog was starting to thin. Something important was coming into view. As investigators closed in on stronger leads, the focus began to tighten around key figures connected to the victims. The case was no longer just about what happened. It was about who might have had the reason, the opportunity, and the mindset to commit something this serious. Detectives reviewed every relationship tied to the victims. Friends, acquaintances, coworkers, family connections, anyone who had recent contact was carefully examined. Sometimes the biggest clues come from the people closest to a situation. Patterns started to emerge. Certain interactions from the past began to feel more meaningful. Old conflicts resurfaced in reports. Tense conversations that once seemed minor now looked suspicious. Small disagreements, personal resentments, and emotional stress started to form a clearer background to the tragedy. Police also began studying behavioral changes in people connected to the case. Who acted nervous after the crime, who avoided questions, who suddenly changed their routine or story. Even subtle shifts in behavior can reveal a lot. At the same time, forensic evidence continued to play a critical role. Lab teams worked around the clock analyzing samples, DNA results, trace materials, digital activity. Every test result added clarity or raised new questions. Even the tiniest fragment of evidence could confirm or challenge a theory. As information came in, detectives reconstructed a more detailed timeline of the hours before and after the crime. Step by step, they mapped out movements, messages, and possible interactions. Who was where, who contacted whom, who might have been lying. The timeline became one of the most powerful tools in the case. Meanwhile, some individuals started to stand out more than others. Their stories didn't fully line up. Their explanations shifted over time. Their emotional reactions seemed unusual, too calm, too defensive, or too inconsistent. Investigators took note. Interrogations grew more intense. Detectives pressed harder, asking direct questions, revisiting past answers, and looking for cracks in each person's story. Some people cooperated fully. Others hesitated. A few became visibly uncomfortable. Every reaction mattered. Behind the scenes, profiling experts weighed in. They studied the nature of the crime, the level of violence, the possible planning involved, and the emotional tone behind the act. Their goal was to better understand the mindset of the person responsible. The profile suggested a mix of emotional intensity and deliberate action. Someone who may have felt pushed, hurt, or obsessed, yet still capable of planning and control. That insight helped narrow the field further. As pressure mounted, investigators also explored whether there were warning signs leading up to the crime. Had anyone noticed threats, unusual messages, or disturbing behavior? Had there been past conflicts that never fully resolved? Some people began to recall moments they had brushed off before, strange comments, tense encounters, or behavior that now seemed more alarming in hindsight. Every memory was documented. The emotional weight of the case continued to grow. Families of the victims remained caught between grief and hope. They wanted justice, but they also wanted honesty. They needed to know what really happened and why. Their pain fueled the urgency of the investigation. Meanwhile, the community remained uneasy. Conversations about the case filled coffee shops, homes, and online forums. Some people tried to help by sharing tips. Others spread speculation. Fear and curiosity continued to collide. Law enforcement worked to filter out rumors and focus strictly on facts. As days passed, certain leads became stronger. Some suspects were ruled out. Others remained under close watch. Detectives compared travel records, phone locations, and activity logs to confirm or challenge alibis. Any mismatch was flagged. Slowly, confidence grew that investigators were getting closer to the truth. Behind closed doors, teams reviewed all collected evidence together: physical findings, witness statements, digital records, and psychological insights. They searched for the moment where everything lined up. That moment was getting closer. At the same time, investigators prepared for the next major step, shifting from broad investigation to more targeted scrutiny. When a case reaches this stage, every move must be careful, calculated, and supported by strong evidence. One wrong step could compromise everything. The tension inside the investigation room rose. Detectives knew they were closing in on critical answers. The pieces were starting to lock into place, forming a story that explained not only what happened asterisk, but how asterisk and why asterisk. But there were still gaps. Questions remained about timing, about intent, about whether the crime was fueled by a single emotion or a chain of escalating events. Solving those final gaps became the top priority. As the case moved forward, it became clear that the coming developments would change everything. The truth was getting closer, and when it surfaced, it would shock many who thought they understood the situation. As investigators moved closer to identifying a main suspect, their approach became more focused and strategic. This phase of the case wasn't about guessing anymore. It was about confirming facts, tightening timelines, and making sure every conclusion could stand up to scrutiny. Detectives began taking a harder look at inconsistencies in statements. Some people had changed their stories. Others had left out details that suddenly felt important. Even small contradictions, a time that didn't match, a place that didn't line up, could reveal deception or fear. Every interview was re-examined. Audio recordings were replayed. Notes were reviewed. Body language, tone shifts, and emotional reactions were analyzed. Investigators wanted to know not just what asterisk people said, but how they said it. At the same time, digital evidence became a key focus. Phone data revealed call histories, message patterns, and location pings. Investigators tracked movements before and after the crime, comparing digital trails to personal statements. If someone claimed to be in one place, the data needed to back it up. In several cases, it didn't. Those mismatches raised serious concerns. Surveillance footage also played a growing role. Cameras from nearby streets, stores, and buildings were reviewed frame by frame. Even a blurry figure or a passing car could provide critical timing clues. Piece by piece, investigators reconstructed the moments leading up to the crime. The timeline now showed rising tension, emotional strain, and possible triggers that may have pushed someone toward a breaking point. There were signs of frustration, signs of resentment, signs of someone feeling cornered or desperate. The crime no longer felt random, it felt personal. Behind the scenes, detectives discussed possible motives in greater depth. Was this driven by anger, betrayal, jealousy, a sense of control, or a mix of emotions that spiraled out of control? Understanding motive mattered because it helped explain behavior, why certain choices were made, and why events unfolded the way they did. Meanwhile, some individuals under scrutiny began showing noticeable stress. Their public behavior changed. They avoided attention. They seemed nervous when questioned. Some tried too hard to appear calm, which only raised more suspicion. Investigators took note of everything. Search warrants were executed. Homes, vehicles, and personal belongings were examined for physical evidence. Clothing, tools, digital devices, anything that could connect someone to the crime scene or the victims. Forensic teams processed every item with precision. Microscopic fibers, biological traces, residue. Each test result either strengthened a theory or forced investigators to reconsider their assumptions. The emotional pressure surrounding the case continued to build. Families of the victims waited anxiously for answers. Every update felt like a lifeline, yet never enough. Their grief remained heavy, mixed with frustration and longing for justice. Community members continued to follow every development closely. Some expressed support for the investigation, others voiced criticism. Everyone wanted resolution and fast. But investigators knew rushing could ruin everything. Behind closed doors, teams held strategy meetings to evaluate their progress. They reviewed what was solid, what was questionable, and what still needed confirmation. The goal was to make sure that when they took the next major step, it would be based on undeniable evidence. Gradually, a clearer suspect profile formed. The person of interest showed patterns of emotional instability, possible resentment toward the victims, and suspicious activity around the time of the crime. Their past actions, recent behavior, and inconsistencies in their story painted a troubling picture. Still, detectives needed airtight proof. They revisited key witnesses, asking sharper, more specific questions. Sometimes, people revealed new details after realizing how serious the situation had become. Other times, they corrected earlier statements that had been influenced by fear, confusion, or memory gaps. Each clarification mattered. The timeline was refined again, now more detailed than ever. Every minute before and after the crime was mapped out. Movements were tracked, contacts were verified, any unexplained gap became a red flag. The case was tightening. As more evidence lined up, investigators began preparing for the possibility of formal charges. But before that could happen, every angle had to be checked. Every claim had to be backed by proof. Every theory had to be tested against hard facts. No room for mistakes. The atmosphere inside the investigative team grew intense. Everyone understood that they were approaching a critical turning point. The decisions made in this phase would shape the entire outcome of the case. Meanwhile, the truth continued to take shape, clearer, sharper, and harder to ignore. What once seemed like a confusing tragedy was now revealing a darker, more deliberate story. One shaped by emotion, choice, and consequence. And as investigators moved closer to the final pieces of the puzzle, it became clear that the next revelations would change how everyone viewed this case. By Sunday afternoon, the investigation had reached a conclusion investigators could no longer avoid. The evidence wasn't pointing in multiple directions anymore. It was narrowing, tightening, forming a single terrifying answer. This wasn't the work of a stranger. This wasn't random. This was organized, planned, personal. And it led straight back to the Miller family. Ballistics confirmed what the timeline already suggested. The shell casings recovered across the three properties matched multiple firearms, weapons known to belong to Jim Miller and his sons. The cleaning patterns found in their barn told another story. Rifles recently used, wiped down, returned to their usual resting places as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something extraordinary had happened. 14 people were dead. and the people responsible had gone home afterward, washed their hands, and tried to sleep. At asterisk 5:20 p.m. asterisk, law enforcement made their move. 8 officers approached the Miller property expecting resistance, expecting fear, expecting denial, maybe even a final violent stand. Instead, they found something far more unsettling. Jim Miller sat calmly on his front porch, unarmed, hands visible, waiting. Behind him stood his sons and son-in-law, Bobby, Thomas, Michael, Danny, and Frank, also unarmed, also still, also resigned. No running, no shouting, no attempt to hide. When Sheriff Buck Morrison stepped out of his vehicle, Jim Miller spoke first. "Sheriff, I expect you're here about last night." There was no confusion in his voice, no pretending. No attempt to shift blame, just acceptance. The men surrendered without resistance. They were taken into custody and transferred out of Crockett County due to security risks and the emotional volatility of the community. Within hours, every one of them confessed. Not because they were pressured, but because they believed they were justified. Jim Miller's recorded statement became one of the most chilling documents in the case. "Those men destroyed us." Not just the fence. They destroyed our dignity, our livelihood, our family's honor. The law wouldn't help. The banks wouldn't wait. We were being pushed into nothing, so we pushed back. He admitted full responsibility. He admitted planning. He admitted intent. And yet he expressed no regret for what he believed was protecting his family. Only regret that it had come to this. The news broke fast. By Monday morning, the case had exploded beyond the town. By Monday afternoon, it had become national news . Texas blood feud, massacre over fence dispute, 14 dead over $950. Media crews flooded Ozona. The town split emotionally. Some residents called the Millers monsters. Others quietly admitted they understood the desperation, even if they could never defend the violence. 14 funerals followed, 14 coffins, 14 families changed forever. While the Millers sat in jail awaiting trial, life continued in painful contrast. Cattle still needed feeding, bills still arrived, babies were still born. Sarah Miller went into early labor from stress, giving birth to a daughter while her husband and father sat behind bars. Margaret Miller kept the ranch running because grief didn't stop responsibility, but nothing felt normal anymore. The arrests marked the end of the violence, but the beginning of something heavier. A legal battle, a moral reckoning, and a legacy that would haunt West Texas for decades, because the question no longer was who did it . The question now was, were they monsters? Or were they ordinary men pushed too far, who chose violence when everything else failed? And the answer would divide people long after the court delivered its verdict. The trial began 6 months later, in March of 1984, far from the town where it all happened. The case had been moved to San Angelo because finding an unbiased jury in Crockett County was impossible. Everyone there knew the victims, everyone knew the Millers, and nearly everyone had an opinion. 6 men sat at the defense table: Jim Miller, Bobby Miller, Thomas Miller, Michael Miller, Danny Miller. Frank Walsh, 84 combined charges of capital murder. The courtroom stayed silent as the prosecution laid out the facts. Confessions, ballistics, crime scene photos, survivor testimony. Timelines down to the minute. The evidence formed a clear picture, not chaos, not a moment of madness, but preparation, planning, coordination. This wasn't something that just happened. It had been built step by step. The defense tried to explain it differently. They argued desperation, financial pressure, fear of losing everything. A system that had failed rural families. They painted Jim Miller as a father backed into a corner, a rancher crushed by debt, a man who felt ignored, disrespected, and powerless. They said the men had snapped, but the prosecution destroyed that claim in less than an hour. Temporary insanity doesn't involve buying ammunition at multiple stores. It doesn't involve rehearsing attack patterns. It doesn't involve assigning roles and timing. This wasn't loss of control. This was choice. The jury listened for 11 long hours across 2 days. When they returned, no one needed to hear the verdict to know the answer. The weight on their faces said everything. Guilty, on all counts, every defendant. 2 weeks later, sentencing was delivered. Jim Miller received the death penalty, later changed to life without parole when Texas paused executions. Bobby Miller, life in prison. Thomas Miller, life. Michael Miller, 60 years. Danny Miller, 45 years. Frank Walsh, 40 years. Jim Miller showed no emotion when the judge read the sentence. No tears, no outburst. Just a slight nod, as if he had expected this outcome from the moment he pulled the trigger. His only request was to see his daughter Sarah and his newborn granddaughter one last time. The request was denied. He was transferred to the Huntsville prison in July of 1984, where he would spend the rest of his life in a small cell, working in the library, keeping a clean record, becoming known as quiet. Polite and disciplined. But prison didn't erase the weight of what he had done. Margaret Miller visited every Sunday for more than 20 years. She drove hundreds of miles each week, sat across from her husband. Talked about cattle, about weather, about their granddaughter growing up. They never spoke about the killings. She held the ranch together after the men were gone, because cattle still needed feeding. Fences still needed mending, bills still needed paying. Grief didn't stop work. Sarah Miller gave birth to her daughter while her husband sat in a jail cell. She raised that child while carrying the burden of her family's name, a name now tied to violence and bloodshed. The funerals of the 14 victims filled churches week after week. Families cried. Children stood at gravesides. Spouses held each other in disbelief. The community never fully healed. Some people demanded harsh punishment. Others admitted they understood the desperation, even if they could never accept the actions. The town carried both shame and sympathy, and time kept moving forward. Years passed. Margaret Miller died in 2006 after decades of emotional exhaustion. Her gravestone honored her strength, her loyalty, her endurance. Jim Miller died in prison in 2008 at 78 years old from a heart attack in the infirmary before sunrise. His last reported words were, "I saved my family's honor." That's all that matters. He was buried in the prison cemetery, no mention of rancher, husband, father, just a name and 2 dates. Some of his sons lived long enough to grow old behind bars. Bobby Miller became known as a quiet inmate who helped others learn to read. Thomas Miller died in a prison riot years later, over a fence dispute of all things. Michael Miller would eventually be paroled after decades, living quietly, burdened by memory. Danny Miller carried guilt so heavy it consumed him years after release. Frank Walsh rebuilt a life but never fully escaped the past. The ripple effects spread far beyond prison walls. Children grew up knowing their family name carried a shadow. Widows rebuilt lives. Survivors struggled with trauma that never faded. The land changed owners. The houses where blood had been spilled were torn down, and the fence that started everything, gone, not repaired. Not honored, not remembered, just removed as if erasing it could erase the cost. But it couldn't, because 14 people had died, 6 men had lost their freedom. Dozens of families carried scars that time couldn't fully heal. And the question that haunted everyone never went away. Was it desperation? Was it pride? Was it rage? Was it love twisted into violence? Or was it simply a reminder of what happens when ordinary people are pushed past their limits? Time moved forward, but the weight of that night never really faded. The families of the victims scattered over the years, like seeds carried by the wind. Some stayed close to the land where their loved ones died. Others left Texas entirely, unable to breathe in places filled with memory and pain. Martha Henderson, the elderly woman who had survived by hiding in a closet, lived longer than anyone expected. She had already survived war, poverty, loss, and hardship, but nothing had shaken her like that night. She rarely spoke about it. When reporters came on anniversaries, she would quietly close the door. Some stories are too heavy to tell out loud. Susan Walker, who had been spared in the chaos, eventually sold the ranch and moved away with her daughter, Amanda. She tried to rebuild a normal life, but grief never fully loosened its grip. Amanda, who had hidden in a bathroom while her family died, struggled with fear, depression, and memories that refused to leave. Even decades later, the trauma followed her. The properties where the killings happened changed hands. New owners arrived who never knew the families who had once lived there. The original homes were torn down. New buildings went up. Fresh paint, clean walls, quiet rooms. But history doesn't disappear just because someone builds over it. In Ozona, there is no public memorial, no plaque, no official reminder of what happened. The town moved on because it had to. Restaurants reopened. Church services continued. Children played in streets where tragedy once unfolded. Life covered the scars with layers of normal. But the scars never fully vanished. The fence that had sparked the conflict, the symbol of pride, land, and resentment, was eventually removed. Not fixed, not honored, just erased. And yet the consequences remained. 14 lives ended, 6 lives imprisoned. Dozens of families changed forever. Years later, people still argued over what Jim Miller truly was, a murderer. A desperate father, a man who loved his family too fiercely, a man who let pride outweigh mercy. The truth was uncomfortable. He was more than one thing at once. He planned the killings. He chose violence. He ended lives without trial or mercy. And at the same time, he was a man who felt abandoned by the system, crushed by debt, humiliated by neighbors, and terrified of losing everything he had built. Both realities existed side by side. And that's what made the story so disturbing, because it forced people to ask a question they didn't want to face. What would you do if you were pushed far enough? How far would you go to protect your family? Where is the line between justice and revenge? At what point does love turn into destruction? There was no clean answer, no perfect ending. No satisfying moral, only the truth that violence creates more violence. Broken systems create desperate people, and desperate people sometimes make unforgivable choices. Decades passed. Rural America continued to struggle in new ways: economic pressure, social change, fading communities, and systems that still failed the people who needed them most. The land where it all happened still exists. The wind still moves through the grass, cattle still graze, the sun still sets over West Texas. And if you stand in the right place at the right time, you can almost imagine the past: 6 men driving through the dark, convinced they had no other option, believing they were protecting something priceless, unaware of the legacy of pain they were creating. Revenge never brings back the dead, it never heals the wounded, it never restores innocence, it only creates more loss. Jim Miller believed he saved his family's honor, but he lost his freedom. Lost his peace, lost his soul. He ended 14 lives and in the process shattered countless others. And in the end, only one question remains: was it worth it? $950 to fix a fence. 14 graves. 6 men behind bars. 40+ years of grief, trauma, and regret. What would you have done if you were in Jim Miller's position? Where do you draw the line between justice and vengeance? Because stories like this aren't just history. They're happening somewhere right now. Other families, other conflicts. Other people standing at the edge. And the answer to what we do in their place might be more uncomfortable than we'd like to admit. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. The story didn't end with the prison sentences. It kept unfolding across decades, spreading through families, shaping lives, and leaving marks that time could soften but never erase. Bobby Miller remained behind bars year after year. He became known as quiet, respectful, and disciplined. He helped other inmates learn to read. He followed the rules. He stayed out of trouble, but he never publicly expressed regret. When asked years later about that night, he said only that he had done what his father asked, and that was what sons were supposed to do. No excuses, no apology, just acceptance of the consequences. Thomas Miller's fate ended violently. He died during a prison riot years after the massacre, a cruel irony, considering the conflict that started everything had been about land and boundaries. He died far from home, far from the ranch, far from the soil he had believed he was protecting. Michael Miller eventually walked free after decades in prison. By then he was older, quieter, and visibly weighed down by memory. He spoke carefully, like someone afraid of stepping on emotional landmines. He said he had spent most of his life thinking about that night, not finding answers, only finding more questions. Danny Miller carried the heaviest burden of guilt. Even after being released, he couldn't escape what he had seen and done. Faces haunted him. Voices echoed in his dreams. He tried therapy, tried work, tried to rebuild some version of a normal life. But the memories never loosened their grip. Eventually, the pain overwhelmed him. Frank Walsh tried to rebuild his future, but the past followed him like a shadow. His marriage fractured under the strain of history and shame. He started over in a different city, with new people who didn't know what he had once been part of. Still, certain things, like the sight of fences or the sound of gunshots in movies, made his hands tremble. The impact spread to the next generation. Sarah Miller raised her daughter while carrying the weight of her family's name. She built a quiet life, surrounded by books and stories, because her own story felt too heavy to say out loud. Emma, the granddaughter born during the fallout, grew up knowing the truth about her grandfather and uncles. She changed her last name to distance herself from the legacy. She chose a career helping broken families, trying to prevent others from repeating the kind of destruction that had shaped her childhood. On the other side, the families of the 14 victims carried their own lifelong scars. Some left town, unable to stay where memories felt alive in the air. Some stayed, determined not to let tragedy erase their roots. Some never fully recovered. Martha Henderson, who had survived by hiding while her family died, lived into old age. She never told her full story. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Susan Walker rebuilt her life far from the ranch where she lost her husband and son. Amanda Walker struggled with trauma that stayed with her for decades: fear, panic, depression, memories that refused to fade. The land itself changed. The ranches were sold. The old homes were torn down. New owners arrived with no emotional ties to the past. The places where blood had once spilled became ordinary again, at least on the surface. The town of Ozona kept moving forward. No official memorial marked what had happened. No plaques explained the tragedy. No signs told visitors they were standing on ground shaped by loss. People ate at restaurants. Kids went to school, church bells rang on Sundays, life went on. But underneath the normal surface, the memory remained, whispered in conversations, remembered in family stories, and felt in the quiet moments when people thought about what had been lost. The fence that had sparked the entire conflict was eventually removed. No one celebrated it. No one mourned it. It simply disappeared, yet the cost of that fence never disappeared. Because 14 people had died, 6 men had lost their freedom, and countless lives had been reshaped by one chain of decisions. And the story kept forcing people to wrestle with the same uncomfortable truth. Ordinary people can do extraordinary harm when pride, fear, and desperation collide. As years passed, the meaning of what happened kept shifting depending on who told the story. To some, Jim Miller remained a cold-blooded killer, a man who planned and carried out a brutal massacre with no mercy. To others, he was a desperate father, crushed by debt, humiliated by neighbors, and pushed to a breaking point by a system that refused to help. Both views existed at the same time. And that contradiction is what makes the story so unsettling, because it doesn't allow a simple answer. It doesn't fit neatly into good versus evil. It forces people to sit with discomfort. Jim Miller chose violence. He planned it. He carried it out. He ended lives that could never be replaced. But he also lived in a world where he felt powerless, ignored, and cornered. A world where banks showed no mercy, neighbors refused compromise, and pride became tangled with survival. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains how someone could reach that point. And that explanation raises a harder question. How many other people are standing on the same edge, facing financial ruin, humiliation, family pressure, and fear, wondering if they'll break? Walk away or fight back in the worst possible way. The uncomfortable truth is that broken systems don't just fail people. They shape them, they push them, they trap them. They sometimes turn ordinary men into people capable of doing unthinkable things. Violence doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows from pressure, from pride, from fear. From feeling like there is no other way out. And once violence begins, it never stays contained. It spreads through families, through communities, through generations. Children grow up with last names tied to tragedy. Widows rebuild lives they never asked for. Survivors carry memories that wake them in the middle of the night. Even decades later, the story still echoes, not because people admire it, but because it warns them. It reminds them how thin the line can be between frustration and rage, between pride and cruelty, between defending your family and destroying someone else. The land where it all happened looks peaceful now. Grass grows, cattle graze, the wind moves quietly across open fields. There is no sign that 14 people died there over a fence, over money, over pride, over fear. But the silence doesn't mean the story is gone. It lives in memories, in whispered conversations. in the way older residents lower their voices when the topic comes up. It lives in the realization that tragedies like this don't start with gunshots. They start with grudges, with resentment, with refusal to compromise, with systems that fail, with people who feel disrespected, ignored, or cornered, and sometimes with one decision that can never be undone. Because these aren't just old stories. They're warnings, they're mirrors, they're reminders of what can happen when pressure builds and patience runs out. And the scariest part is this: the people at the center of these tragedies often look just like everyone else, until the moment they cross a line they can never step back from. Decades passed, but the shadow of that night never fully disappeared. Time softened some edges, but it didn't erase the memory. People aged, families changed, towns grew quieter. But the story of what happened in West Texas stayed alive, told in fragments, whispered in conversations, and remembered in uneasy silence. The land didn't look like a crime scene anymore. Tall grass covered old tracks. New fences stood where old ones had fallen. Cattle grazed peacefully on ground once soaked in blood. If someone drove through the area without knowing the history, it would look like just another stretch of ranch land, calm, wide, and endless. But for those who remembered, the quiet felt heavy. It carried echoes. The Miller name slowly faded from the land. The ranch changed hands. New owners arrived who had no connection to the past. They worked the soil, raised cattle, and built their lives without wanting to dig into old wounds. Still, the history lingered. Some townspeople refused to talk about it. Others debated it endlessly. Some remembered the victims, some remembered the Millers, some remembered both. And no one could agree on how to define what happened. Was it murder? Yes. Was it fueled by desperation? Also yes. Was it evil? Was it tragic? Was it preventable? The uncomfortable answer was that it was all of those things at once. 14 people lost their lives: mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, neighbors, friends. 6 men lost their freedom, their futures locked behind prison walls. And dozens of families carried emotional scars that never fully healed. Years later, people still ask the same painful questions. Could this have been avoided? Could pride have been swallowed? Could forgiveness have stopped the violence? Could the system have stepped in before everything fell apart? All signs pointed to the same haunting truth. Yes, the tragedy didn't start with gunfire. It started with tension, with resentment, with feeling disrespected, with financial pressure, with fear of losing everything, and with people who felt they had no one left to turn to. Broken systems played their part. So did stubborn pride. So did silence. So did the refusal to compromise, and when all those forces collided, the result was catastrophic. The story became more than a crime case. It became a warning, a reminder that violence doesn't come out of nowhere, that ordinary people can be pushed into doing terrible things. That anger, fear, and desperation, if left unchecked, can destroy lives on both sides. Over time, the tragedy stopped being front-page news. New generations grew up hearing about it secondhand. Some learned about it in school. Some heard it from parents. Some only discovered it years later. But even for those who weren't alive when it happened, the weight of it could still be felt. Because the impact didn't stay in the past. It lived on in. Survivors who struggled with trauma, children raised under the shadow of a violent legacy, families who rebuilt their lives while carrying grief, a town that never fully found closure. And as time went on, the story took on a deeper meaning. It stopped being just about a fence, or money, or a feud. It became about human limits. How much pressure can someone take before they break? How far will someone go to protect their family? Where does justice end and revenge begin? And what happens when people feel the system has abandoned them? The truth is uncomfortable. Most people like to believe that only monsters commit acts like this, but the reality is more disturbing. The people involved were not strangers. They were fathers, sons, husbands, neighbors. Ordinary men until the moment they crossed a line. That's what makes the story so haunting. Because it forces us to confront a thought we don't like. Under the wrong pressure, in the wrong moment, could anyone become capable of something terrible? The story doesn't offer an easy answer. It doesn't end with a hero. It doesn't end with clean justice. It doesn't end with peace. It ends with consequences, lifelong prison sentences, broken families, generational trauma, and a community forever marked by one chain of decisions. Even now, decades later, the questions remain open. What would you have done? Would you have chosen patience? Would you have walked away? Would you have forgiven, or would you have made the same tragic choice? And that's why this story still matters, because it isn't just history. It's a reflection of pressure, pride, fear, love, and human weakness. It's a reminder that sometimes the line between right and wrong becomes dangerously thin, and once it's crossed, there's no going back. The story still lingers because it forces people to face uncomfortable truths about themselves. It reminds us that tragedy doesn't always come from pure evil. Sometimes it grows from frustration, fear, pride, love, and desperation, all mixed together until something breaks. What happened in West Texas wasn't just about land. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about offense. It was about people feeling cornered, feeling ignored, feeling disrespected, feeling like they were running out of options. And when people feel like they have nothing left to lose, they sometimes make decisions that change lives forever. The legal system delivered its verdicts. Prisons held the men responsible. Time passed, but time doesn't erase emotional damage. Survivors carried trauma that followed them for decades. Children grew up hearing stories they never asked to inherit. Families tried to rebuild, but some wounds never fully healed. Even people who had nothing to do with the tragedy felt its weight. Neighbors questioned how well they truly knew one another. Parents wondered what they would do if their own families were threatened. Communities quietly reflected on how easily conflict can spiral out of control. And the deeper people looked, the clearer one truth became: this didn't have to happen. A fence could have been repaired. A compromise could have been made. A conversation could have replaced gunfire. A moment of patience could have saved 14 lives, but pride stood in the way. Fear stood in the way. Stubbornness stood in the way. And once violence started, it couldn't be undone. The land moved on, but memory didn't. Sunset still painted the sky over wide Texas fields. Wind still moved through mesquite trees. Cattle still grazed without knowing the history beneath their hooves. And yet, for those who remembered, the past felt close, almost alive. It lived in the names of people who were gone. In the empty spaces where homes once stood. In the quiet tension that surfaced whenever the story was brought up. Some people believed Jim Miller was a villain, pure and simple. Others believed he was a tragic figure, a man who made unforgivable choices under unbearable pressure. The truth sits somewhere in the middle. He was responsible. He was guilty. He caused irreversible harm. And he was also human, flawed, emotional, pressured, and capable of making terrible decisions. That duality is what makes the story so powerful. Because it refuses to let us label it as something distant or unrealistic. It forces us to confront a reality we don't like to admit. The line between ordinary life and irreversible tragedy can be thinner than we think. A series of bad choices, a buildup of resentment, a refusal to let go, a moment where anger outweighs reason, and suddenly lives are lost, families are shattered, communities are scarred. That's why this case continues to be talked about decades later, not because people glorify it, but because it warns them. It warns about pride, about vengeance, about what happens when communication fails, about what happens when systems fail, and about what happens when people decide violence is the only answer left. The most haunting part is this: everyone involved believed they were justified in some way. The victims believed they had a right to their land. The Millers believed they were protecting their family and survival. Both sides believed they were standing their ground, and in the end, everyone lost. 14 people lost their lives. 6 men lost their freedom. Countless loved ones lost peace, stability, and a sense of safety. There were no winners, only consequences. And those consequences echo far beyond one town, one feud, or one generation. Because stories like this don't just belong to the past. They're reminders of what can happen anywhere, when pressure builds, when anger goes unchecked, and when people stop seeing each other as human beings. These stories aren't meant to entertain alone. They're meant to make us think, to make us question, to make us pause before reacting in anger. Because sometimes, the difference between peace and tragedy comes down to one decision, one moment of restraint, one choice not to cross a line that can never be uncrossed. The aftermath of what happened didn't fade quietly. It followed the people involved like a shadow that never let go. Years passed, but the weight of that violence stayed heavy. Families of the victims tried to rebuild their lives, but grief doesn't run on a clock. Some learned to cope, some never fully recovered. Some carried anger that burned quietly for the rest of their lives. Every holiday felt different. Every family gathering felt incomplete. Every memory carried both love and pain. For them, the story wasn't history, it was personal. And for the families of the men who carried out the violence, life didn't return to normal either. They faced judgment from neighbors. Whispers in grocery stores, looks that said more than words ever could. Children grew up with last names tied to a tragedy they didn't create. Wives carried shame mixed with heartbreak. Parents lived knowing their sons' choices changed lives forever. No one walked away untouched. Even law enforcement officers who handled the case later admitted it stayed with them. They remembered the crime scene. They remembered the interviews. They remembered the shock in people's voices. Some said it changed how they saw human nature. It showed them how quickly normal people can cross a line, how fast anger can turn into action, how consequences can spread far beyond the original moment. And as time passed, the story slowly became part of American crime history. Books were written, articles were published, researchers analyzed the case. But no report or documentary could fully capture the emotional damage, because numbers don't show heartbreak, dates don't show trauma, and timelines don't show regret. One of the most disturbing parts of the case was how preventable it all felt. People kept asking the same painful question. What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if there had been a mediator? What if cooler heads had prevailed? What if pride had been set aside? But history doesn't allow rewrites. Once actions are taken, they can't be undone. And that's what makes this case so haunting. It wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't fate, it was a chain of choices, small decisions, growing resentment, unresolved tension, escalating conflict, each step leading closer to disaster. And when the final step was taken, there was no turning back. This story also forced people to confront a hard truth about justice. Some felt the sentences were fair, others felt they were too light. Some believed no punishment could ever balance the loss of life. Justice, in this case, felt complicated, because punishment didn't bring the dead back, it didn't erase trauma. It didn't fix broken families. It only acknowledged that a wrong had been committed, and even that acknowledgement felt incomplete to many. As the years went on, people began to view the tragedy less as a feud and more as a lesson about conflict, a lesson about ego, a lesson about what happens when communication breaks down. Teachers mentioned it in classrooms, writers used it as a case study, community leaders pointed to it as a warning. Not because they wanted to reopen wounds, but because they wanted to prevent new ones. The message became clear: violence doesn't solve disputes, it multiplies suffering. One act can destroy generations. One moment of rage can rewrite entire family histories. And even if the original reasons fade, the consequences remain. People also started reflecting on how easily ordinary conflicts can spiral. A disagreement over property, a misunderstanding, a grudge that isn't addressed. If left to grow, even small disputes can become deadly. And that realization made the story feel close to home for many viewers, because it didn't start as something dramatic. It started as tension. It started as resentment. It started as pride, things that exist in everyday life. That's why this case continues to hold attention. It's not just about what happened, it's about how it happened. And what it teaches about human behavior. The truth is uncomfortable. It shows that tragedy doesn't always come from monsters. Sometimes it comes from regular people making irreversible choices. And that realization forces people to look inward, to question how they handle anger, to question how they respond to conflict, to question how close anyone could be to crossing a line. The story doesn't fade because it isn't just about one place or one family. It represents something bigger. It shows what can happen when people stop talking and start hardening their hearts. When pride becomes more important than peace. When fear becomes stronger than reason. When anger replaces patience. Over time, the details of the case became less important than the meaning behind it. People stopped asking only what happened and started asking why it happened. Why did no one step in sooner? Why did no one force a compromise? Why did the system fail so completely? Why did people feel so alone that violence felt like the only option? Those questions still don't have easy answers. But they point to a truth that keeps repeating in human history. When people feel trapped, unheard, and disrespected, they don't always make rational choices. They make emotional ones. They act from fear, from anger, from pride, from love twisted into protection at any cost. And once those emotions take control, logic fades. That's how disasters begin. Not with one big moment, but with many small ones. Unspoken grudges, unresolved conflicts, ignored warnings, refused apologies. Step by step, the path narrows, until one choice changes everything. The legacy of this story isn't just prison sentences or headlines. It's the reminder that violence is never isolated. It spreads outward like a shockwave. It hits parents, children, friends, neighbors, entire communities. It changes how people trust, how they see each other, how safe they feel in their own towns, and once that trust is broken, it's almost impossible to fully restore. The most painful part is that everyone involved believed they were acting in defense of something important: land, family, honor, survival, dignity. But in the end, all of those things were lost anyway. The land changed hands, families were destroyed, honor turned into shame, survival turned into prison sentences. Nothing they tried to protect was truly saved. Only damage remained. That's the cruel irony of violence. It promises control, it promises protection, it promises resolution, but it delivers loss. Pain, regret, and emptiness. Even decades later, the story still teaches the same lesson. No one wins when violence becomes the answer. Not the victims, not the attackers, not the families. Not the community, only suffering grows. That's why this case still matters, because it isn't about the past alone. It's about the present. It's about every conflict that feels too big to handle. Every argument that feels personal. Every situation where pride and anger start to take over. It's a reminder to pause, to breathe, to step back, to choose restraint over reaction. Because once a line is crossed, there's no undo button, no reset, no rewind, only consequences. Do you believe violence is ever justified? Where do you draw the line between protection and revenge? What would you have done if you were in their place? Because these questions aren't just for history books. They're for all of us, every day, in every conflict, in every hard choice. And the way we answer them shapes the kind of world we live in. As the years went by, this case slowly shifted from being a shocking crime story to becoming a warning people couldn't ignore. It stopped being just about what happened. It became about what it represents. A reminder of how fast normal life can fall apart. A reminder of how fragile peace can be. A reminder that one decision can change the direction of dozens of lives. People who studied the case often said the same thing. This wasn't inevitable. This wasn't destiny. This wasn't unavoidable. It was preventable. That idea haunted many who learned about it. Because if it could have been prevented, then responsibility didn't just fall on the people who pulled the trigger. It also touched the people who stayed silent, the people who ignored warning signs, the people who let tension grow instead of stepping in. It raised uncomfortable questions about accountability. Not just legal accountability, but moral accountability. Who should have spoken up? Who should have intervened? Who could have de-escalated the conflict before it exploded? And how many tragedies in history followed the same pattern? Small disagreements left to rot, pride allowed to grow unchecked, anger nurtured instead of resolved, until one day it turns deadly. This story also forced people to confront how conflict is handled in society. Do we encourage communication or confrontation? Do we reward compromise or dominance? Do we teach patience or retaliation? Because in this case, retaliation led to ruin. And once the violence was done, there was no clean ending, no satisfying closure, no perfect resolution. Just loss layered on top of loss. For some families, healing took decades. For others, it never fully came. Some found peace through forgiveness, some through distance, some through silence. Some never found it at all, and that pain became part of their identity, a shadow passed down through generations. Children and grandchildren grew up knowing the story even if they never wanted to. It became part of family history, not as pride, but as a scar. At the same time, the case continued to spark debate among historians, criminologists, and everyday people. Was it driven more by fear or by greed? Was it fueled more by pride or by desperation? Were the people involved villains or deeply flawed humans pushed past their limits? There's no single answer. And that complexity is part of what keeps the story alive. It refuses to be simple. It refuses to fit into a clean moral box. Instead, it forces us to wrestle with gray areas. Because real life isn't always black and white. People aren't always purely evil or purely good. Motives are often tangled, messy, and emotional, and that makes the consequences even more tragic. If there's one theme that keeps repeating in this story, it's this. When people stop seeing each other as human, tragedy becomes easier. Enemies replace neighbors, targets replace people. Anger replaces empathy, and once that happens, harm feels justified, even when it shouldn't. This case also highlights how important it is to address conflict early. To talk before resentment hardens, to listen before pride takes over, to step back before anger turns into action. Because once violence happens, there's no clean way back. No apology can undo it. No sentence can erase it. No amount of regret can reverse it. That's why this story still matters today, not just as history, but as a lesson about restraint, a lesson about humility, a lesson about the true cost of revenge. By the end of this story, what lingers most isn't just the crime itself. It's the realization of how easily everything unraveled. What started as tension turned into conflict. What turned into conflict became violence, and what became violence turned into lifelong consequences. This case stands as a mirror, not just of the people involved, but of human nature as a whole. It shows how fear can distort judgment, how pride can block reason, how anger can overpower empathy, how silence can be just as dangerous as action. And it reminds us that most tragedies don't begin with evil intentions. They begin with unresolved emotions, unspoken resentments, refused compromises, and the belief that backing down means losing. But in reality, backing down can sometimes save lives. Looking back, it's clear that multiple turning points existed. Moments where a different choice could have changed everything. Moments where patience could have prevented disaster. Moments where listening could have replaced hostility. Yet none of those chances were taken. And because of that, families were torn apart, lives were lost, futures were rewritten. The weight of that reality is what keeps this story alive in public memory. Not because people want to relive the violence, but because they want to understand it, to learn from it, to prevent something like it from happening again. It also forces a deeper reflection. How many conflicts in our own lives carry the same seeds? How many arguments could escalate if left unchecked? How many grudges quietly grow into something dangerous? Because this story proves one thing very clearly: tragedy doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly, day by day, until it's too late to stop. And the hardest truth of all is this: everyone involved thought they were acting for a reason. Everyone believed they were justified in some way. Everyone felt they were protecting something important. But in the end, no one truly won, only loss remained. That's why this story continues to matter, not as entertainment, but as a warning. A warning about what happens when we let emotions control decisions. A warning about what happens when we stop seeing the humanity in others. A warning about what happens when pride becomes more important than peace. If this story made you think, reflect, or see conflict differently, make sure to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to the channel if you want more powerful true stories that explore real crime, real consequences, and the deeper psychology behind human behavior. These stories aren't here just to shock you. They're here to remind you, to challenge you, to make you pause the next time anger tries to take control. Because sometimes, the difference between peace and tragedy comes down to one choice, one breath, one decision to step back instead of striking forward. And remembering that might just save a life someday.